Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
And very special guest, Sheila Wray Gregoire. Sheila, welcome.
Well, thank you. It's so fun to actually meet you, kind of.
Yeah, likewise.
See you this time.
You know, it's interesting. You only live like probably 5 hours from us.
Oh, yeah. Where are you?
Yeah, so we're in Southwest Pennsylvania.
Okay.
And I have family who lives in, now I'm blanking on the name of the little town in Canada. No, in Canada.
Yeah.
Natalie's family, it's up in Canada. Anyway, we go up all the time. So, or used to, till COVID hit.
Well, one of my co-authors for The Great Sex Rescue, Joanna Sawatsky, is from Pittsburgh. So.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. So, Sheila is the face behind To Love, Honor, and Vacuum.com. And she is a marriage blogger, and you live, breathe, and write about marriage. And now your most controversial work, The Great Sex Rescue, and you've been getting a lot of heat online. So, I mean, we're just going to dig right in and talk about your excellent book.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Yeah, I am too. So you wrote this book with one of your daughters, and I just want to ask you what led you to write The Great Sex Rescue.
So I've been blogging about marriage and sex since 2008. I started out as a typical mommy blogger, and I found the more I talked about sex, the more my traffic grew. So I kind of started gravitating towards the sex side. And in 2012, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex came out. 31 Days to Great Sex came out shortly after that. I was putting out courses, all these books. I was saying all this great stuff. And yet it seemed like everyone still had the same issues. And I couldn't figure out what the problem was. And then 2 years ago, I sat down and I read the book Love and Respect. And I know this is weird, but even though I write about marriage and sex, I hadn't actually read a lot of Christian marriage books because I was always afraid to plagiarize. So I figured, hey, they love Jesus. I love Jesus. We're all saying the same thing, and I would recommend books that I hadn't read because other people told me they were good. And I just saw this Twitter conversation one day in January of 2019 where a woman was saying how she needs respect too, not just love. And I'm like, yeah, so do I. So I had a migraine that day. I didn't really want to work. So I thought, I'll just sit down and read a book instead. And I read Love and Respect, and it was like my world shifted and everything. It was like an earthquake went off in my living room because that sex chapter, because that's what I read first, was so awful. I mean, I don't have words to describe it.
I read Love and Respect too. So years ago, but I know what you mean. Yeah.
He said, if your husband is typical, he has a need you don't have, that husbands have a need for physical release, that if they don't get it, they'll come under satanic attack, that men have affairs if they're deprived of sex. You can't say no except for prayer and fasting, and you need to be sympathetic with your husband's struggle with lust. And that's really all they said. They never mentioned that women can feel pleasure. Never once. He never mentioned that sex is intimate. It was only about a husband's physical release. And I'm reading this thing and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, maybe this is the root of our problems. And so together with my daughter, Rebecca, who's trained in psychometrics, which is like survey design, and Joanna Sawatsky, who's an epidemiologist and really good with stats, we just thought we're just gonna look at it. We're gonna do a huge survey and we're gonna figure out if evangelical teachings have actually messed this all up for men and women.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, for me, that was something that was really telling because I was reading some of the charts in the book and I was like, and a lot of the Christian books on sex and marriage, which really, I guess they're on marriage and they briefly mention sex, but they all have a common thread, right? This is such a common theme throughout all the Christian books that are out there, or the majority of Christian books that are out there. And it's really toxic.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. I don't remember what it was, but you had put a post, you had tagged me in a tweet like a couple weeks ago. And I just don't even remember because so many flash before my eyes in any given day. But it was about child sexual abuse. And I thought about this because your book is so important, not just for Christian marriages, but also for developing a theology of sex, because I hear this a lot. And I remember we've mentioned this on our podcast before, but I remember reading an email that was given to me by an attorney that was a correspondence among elders at a church where the pastor had gotten caught by a police officer on a Wednesday night after their Wednesday night Bible study. He had a 15-year-old girl in the car, and this pastor was caught by the police officer sodomizing her in a vacant parking lot. And, this attorney who had ties to that congregation, he said, this is far worse than what's being reported. So he sent me this email exchange among these elders. And the one elder said, this girl has a history of problems and, the way she dresses. And his comment, what grown man wouldn't be tempted if a girl like this came dressed the way that she dresses?
When I hear things like that, always has, always will. And it's, that seems to be such a focus, that women are.
And kids.
Kids are sexual objects. And if they want to preserve their purity, they'll dress right, they'll act right, they'll talk right. It's so much burden placed on a woman, so much stress on a woman. And you are so right. There is nothing about intimacy, about relationship, about pleasure, about the deep conversing, or communication is the word I want. Sex is communication on a level that no husband and wife, nobody else can have except them. And it just makes me kind of crazy when I hear comments like that. Just, if only she had dressed better, she wouldn't have gotten raped if she didn't dress like that. Yeah. I know
Well, that story that you shared is very similar to one that's in Every Man's Battle. I don't know if you've read that book recently, but I
haven't.
Be very happy. But there's a story of
I'll put it on my do not read list.
There's a story of a guy in his 30s who's volunteering with a youth group. So he's a volunteer leader. And there's a 15-year-old that they describe as, she looked a lot older than that. She was very flirty. She'd done a lot with other boys. And this leader started, flirting with her and daring her to do things. And one night they ended up having sex in his car. And this was really awful because now the parents were going to report him for statutory rape and his life would be ruined. And it never once expressed any concern for the girl. It just described her in language which justified what he did. And the way that this story was framed was that he was trespassing on his neighbor's fence or something. Like it was going against boundaries. So I guess it means like taking the father's property. I'm not even sure what they meant by that. But again, it's this idea that he can't help it because he's a lust monster.
Yeah.
And so it really is on women. And one of the things that we did in our survey was we were looking at which evangelical teachings are correlated with worse outcomes for women. And one of the really big ones that's very toxic is this idea that all men struggle with lust. It's every man's battle. When women believe that, orgasm rates go down, arousal rates go down, trust in your husband goes down, marital satisfaction goes down, and sexual pain goes up. Because you're telling women he can't really know you. He can't really want you. He's going to want everyone else, and you're just a substitute for what he really wants.
Yeah, and you talk too about, that pressure to perform and how it erases the most important part for women. And it's the process of arousal, it's the process of intimacy leading up to arousal. That pressure to perform it's not healthy. It's toxic. So
a lot of our ethics around sex for women are a lot of our messaging is you need to have sex under threat. So you need to have sex or he'll have an affair.
Yeah.
You need to have sex or he'll lust. You need to have sex or he'll watch porn. Or you need to have sex or God's going to be mad at you because you're not allowed to deprive him. And so, we keep giving women these messages that sex is something which you need to do or something bad will happen to you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's intimidating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, your book, so the title, The Great Sex Rescue, what led you to that title? What are you rescuing, or what are we rescuing sex from?
I think we're just trying to get out of this mindset that sex is primarily for men and that sex is an ugly thing. And we're trying to get back to the biblical view of sex. And I like what you said about sexual ethics, because in a way, I kind of feel like this book is a book of let's figure out what biblical sexual ethics are. And the way that I like to frame it, you can sort of see it in three ways. Like the biblical view of sex, first of all, in Genesis 4, there's that weird verse that we don't know what to do with where it says Adam knew his wife Eve and they conceived a son. And it's easy to think, well, maybe God's just embarrassed of using the real word there. But I don't think that's what it is, because the Hebrew word to know is the same word that David uses when he says, search me and know me, oh God. It's this deep intimacy.
Yeah.
So sex is intimate. It means both people matter. It's not just about one person's physical release. It's intimate. And then we know from Song of Solomon that it's supposed to be pleasurable. And we know from 1 Corinthians 7 that it's totally and utterly mutual. Yes. And so you have this picture of something which is intimate, pleasurable, and mutual. It's about both of you. It builds your relationship. It's life-giving. It's not soul-crushing. And so how can we talk about sex in marriage in that way rather than seeing it as a male entitlement?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I've heard so many people, I don't know if you've run into this too, but where I hear people bashing the Apostle Paul saying things like he was a misogynist, because of that passage in 1 Corinthians 7, where they say, here's a guy, single dude, not married, telling women when and how to have sex with their husbands. And I never read it that way. I never read that as, the husband is entitled to have sex when he wants it. And, the only time that they're allowed to not have it is if they're praying together, and otherwise he's being deprived. I never read it that way. And it's a shame so many people do, but I think it's because of this quote unquote Christian literature that uses that passage in that way to say that, men are the receivers and, it's the women's duty to gratify them.
Yeah, it's interesting because I see the passage the same way you do. I think it's a very pro-woman passage. I think it's the second most weaponized verse against women. The first would be women submit to your husbands. That's weaponized a lot. Yeah. I think this is the second most weaponized passage. And I think Paul would be appalled because if you look at what it says in 1 Corinthians 7, 3-5, the very first thing it says is that the husband must perform his marital duties to his wife. So the wife's needs are mentioned first.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to say that the wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. The husband's body does not belong to him, but also to the wife, and do not deprive each other except by mutual consent and for a time. So everything that's given to him is also given to her. But here's what's cool. In Roman times, husbands owned their wives' bodies completely, to the extent that you could murder your wife and not be prosecuted for it.
Yeah.
Like you totally owned your wife's body. And in the middle of that, Paul walks in and says, sure, her body doesn't belong to her, but also to you. But hey, guys, your body belongs to her as well. Like that was revolutionary.
Yeah.
You know,
and then point.
And then he says, you do not have authority over your own body, but she does. Like the only time Paul explicitly talks about authority in marriage is in that passage where he actually uses the words authority, and it's totally mutual.
Yeah. Yeah.
So really I think it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. I always say too, like it's a shame. I think the word submit is an unfortunate translation too. And I'm not a Greek scholar, but I took a few years of Koine Greek. I've lost about 90% of it. But I said, the word submit is a really unfortunate translation, because that word, that word and its cognates are usually meant in the sense of yielding to. So, I've given the example before in blog posts, and I said, this idea of church leaders saying submit to our authority is really anti-biblical. And I said, like the word yield, I used to drive trucks. So like, I had an 80,000 pound truck going up against all these little bitty 3,000 pound cars, and whoever's yielding, they're merging onto the highway with everybody else. And it's the yielder's job to watch out for everybody else. You have to be careful. Your size doesn't matter. Your weight doesn't matter. Your aggression doesn't give you the entitlement to jump onto that highway. Like, you're watching out for the good of everybody. So when you're yielding, you're merging with other people, but you're doing it in a safe manner where you're all going along at the same pace. That's the sense of that word submit. It's not, bow down to and
right.
be under the thumb of. That's not what the word means.
Obviously, I have a lot more years on me than you all do.
Got that right.
I knew you'd say that, Jimmy. And growing up in the church, there was such a, I will call it almost a badgering of women from the pulpit, including in the area of sex. But I grew up at a time when women were to be obedient to their husbands. And it saddens me so much, because I think of so many women that I've talked with who they've left their marriages, or they went years and years and years being so unhappy and so unfulfilled because of those statements that they had to be subservient, that they had to be obedient, and in sex also. And there was never this communication that is God intended. I think that level of intimacy that God has provided is the most beautiful, wonderful thing in the world. And it makes me happy to see your book out there and getting in the hands and hearts of so many people, because it's been a taboo topic for so very long. It's just been accepted that women are servants, even servants in sex. And that's how it should be. And that's not how it should be. That's not how God intended it at all. And it is just, you're kind of turning things, helping turn the tide here. I love it. I just appreciate it so much, because so many women have suffered so much in marriages because of this one issue. They really have. It's been sad. It's been, I grew up at a time, I grew up at a time when women were to be quiet, and they were, to do whatever their husbands wanted, whenever they wanted, including with sex. And it's just such a demeaning, lowering of life and what God intended it to be.
Yeah, it's a demeaning of women, but it's also, this is something we're trying to say in the book, is it's a demeaning of sex as well, right? Because if sex is supposed to be mutual, intimate, and pleasurable, then when we say, like when we use 1 Corinthians 7, do not deprive each other, what is Paul actually saying you're not supposed to deprive each other of? Because the way that that's often used is, hey, women, you can't say no if your husband wants intercourse.
Right.
Yes.
But intercourse is not necessarily something which is mutual, intimate, and pleasurable. What Paul is talking about is a biblical sexual relationship. He isn't talking about one-sided intercourse. Right. He's not saying to women, do not, if we think of sex as just intercourse where he orgasms and she doesn't, because only about 48% of women reach orgasm almost every time they have sex. Most women struggle quite a bit. And of those who do reach orgasm, only 39% do through intercourse alone. And yet when we talk about sex, we tend to think sex equals intercourse, and that doesn't really work for a lot of women.
Yeah.
But if we think of sex as only intercourse, and then we read 1 Corinthians 7 is do not deprive her of intercourse. Well, she's already being deprived. If all you're doing is one-sided intercourse, she's already being deprived. You've already, like, that ship has already sailed. And so that is so not what Paul is talking about here. And we need to stop weaponizing those verses.
Don't you think, in a sense, this deprives a man also of what was supposed to, how this was supposed to be? When a man gives his wife pleasure in that way, it is so gratifying. And I think that makes a man feel more of how he should be with the woman that he loves, because they are communicating and they are joined in such a special way, where he can see her pleasure and she sees his. It's not one-sided. I just think men are missing the boat too by
absolutely. And, after we surveyed the 20,000 women, we did a bunch of focus groups and interviews so that we didn't just have stats, we had stories too. And what we heard over and over and over again from women is, I really struggled when I first got married because I came into marriage with a lot of these ideas about how I had to have sex, every time he wanted it. I had to have sex or he was going to be tempted. I very much felt the obligation. And sex wasn't good for me. And when I sat down and talked to my husband about it, he was appalled. Like almost all of them said, my husband never wanted me to feel that way. This was stuff I learned from Christian books. I didn't learn it from my husband. And who reads Christian books? It's women. Like a lot of guys have no idea what their wives have heard.
Yeah.
It's not men who go on these women's conferences and hear all this stuff, right? So women are hearing this stuff that men don't even know about. And woman after woman told us, when I explained to my husband how I felt, he said, I never want you to do something you don't want to do. Like if we're ever in the middle of something and you want to stop, we're going to stop. And so many told us, like, that is what unlocked my sexuality for me, was my husband giving me the freedom to say no.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's huge.
Yep.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. And I mean, it's pretty ironic that these self-help books, or whatever you want to label them, are written by men.
A lot of them are. I mean, not all. Like some. We took the 13 of the best-selling sex and marriage books, and we scored them on our rubric of 12 points of healthy sexuality, and the ones that scored the worst were pretty bad. But a few of the ones that scored the worst were actually written by women. So. Shanti Felden's For Women Only scored fairly badly. Power of a Praying Wife scored fairly badly. Whereas some books written by men, like Boundaries in Marriage, scored really well. The Gift of Sex scored amazing by the Penners. That one scored really well. So,
yeah. It's a really twisted theology of I guess you could call it theology of sex, but it's pretty bizarre. So, what was the most surprising thing that you found throughout all of your research in this area for this book?
Well, I don't know if it was surprising, but it was gratifying, because one of the questions that we went into this study looking at is, why is it that religiously conservative women have twice the rate of sexual pain as the general population? We wanted to figure that out.
Yeah.
Because everybody knows what erectile dysfunction is. Very few people even know the word vaginismus. But if you look at couples under the age of 45, vaginismus is way more common.
I just want to say I never heard of that term until I read your book.
Yeah, so, most people haven't. It's a sexual dysfunction where the muscles in the vaginal wall contract, which makes it really hard to relax, and it makes penetration very painful, if not impossible. And we found that 22% of Christian women have experienced this, 7% to the point that penetration is impossible, which is much higher than the general population. And so we wanted to know why, because people have known this, like it's in the literature for like 50, 60 years that, hey, if you're, gynecologists, pelvic floor physiotherapists will tell you that the majority of their patients with vaginismus are conservative Christians. So what's going on?
Yeah, you're right.
And we were hoping that we could figure that out. And we did. what we found is that when women believe the obligation sex message, so I am obligated to give my husband sex when he wants it, that has almost virtually the same effect on increasing her chances of having vaginismus as prior sexual abuse does. Because both sexual abuse and the obligation sex message say to women, you don't matter. He has the right to use you no matter what you're feeling. And our bodies interpret that as trauma. It's a traumatic message. And that's what's being given by the majority of our Christian resources.
Yeah.
That is huge. And I hope that people, when they read that, when they listen to you on this interview, really grasp what you just said. That is enormous. It's more just a little something. It's huge. And the fear involved, the intimidation, the trauma, all of that makes it impossible to enjoy, what would be very pleasurable. It truly does. And it's there again, being objectified was never right. It never is right when that happens to women. So I hope if people grasp one big thing from this book, that would be one of the big things they grasp from your book. I appreciate so much your willingness to, talk about it even. Back in my day, sex was, it was not talked about. You knew it was done, but you didn't know how it was done and you didn't know why. And it just was not talked about, especially not in churches. That was just and that makes it also difficult when there's so much misunderstanding. So
that was pretty enlightening for me too. I mean, on that subject, and as somebody who has young children, this idea that people, it wasn't just, way back in your day. it's happening now, right? Like you talk about it in your book where so many women, and I forget what the number was, what the percentage was, but so many Christian women don't know what their body parts are. They can't name their body parts. They know what a vagina is, but besides for that, they don't know what their body parts are and what they do and how they function. That's terrifying to me. And, that lends itself to such confusion in an already confused area about sexuality. And, given what's kind of floating out there outside of the church, it's not any healthier, in my opinion, where, it's this, just explore and like figure it out. I mean, it's almost the same message, just packaged a little bit differently.
Yeah.
So
and we've taken the sacredness out of everything, but sacred doesn't need to mean secret. Like sacred just simply means you put it in the right place.
Yeah.
And we haven't done that.
Yeah. So I guess my question to you, I get asked this question a lot about teaching your children body parts and proper anatomical names and how to kind of know that they're being abused if somebody's touching them inappropriately. But I think even beyond that, and as importantly, how do we teach our kids to talk about body parts and what they do? And at what age do you start talking to your kids about sexuality? Because they're going to be exposed to pornography and, all that stuff. Devices are in the hands of everybody. And they're going to be exposed to it.
I think by the time a child's 10, at least, they need to have a good knowledge of pretty much everything. Like they need to know how sex works. Girls especially need to know about your period, because girls tend to reach puberty about 1.5 to 2 years earlier than boys. So they need to know what their period is. And when you're explaining period, you need to explain sex, like how sex works. Like the reason you have a period is because the egg is released, and if the egg isn't fertilized, like they need to understand all of that. And it can be scientific. I think the mistake that was made in purity culture is that they always paired teaching about sex with making sure kids pledge never to do it. which pairs it with a very shameful message. I mean, a 10-year-old, when they first hear about sex, they will pledge never to look at a boy ever again because they're so grossed out. Like, it's not appropriate to talk. So, we actually, on my site, it's lovehonorandvacuum.com. We have puberty courses that my daughters created to share with girls, and that my sons-in-law created to share with boys. So just video-based stuff. It's a lot of fun. But we separate it into age groups. So in the earlier one, it's all the science and how to handle your body changes. And then in the older one, more when they're 13, 14, then that's when you start to talk about, dating and how to decide your boundaries. But I think, and that's really, really important to know, because one of the most dangerous messages that we found was this idea of boundaries and teenagers, because the message boys will push girls' sexual boundaries is really widespread. We say this in youth group all the time. Boys will push girls' sexual boundaries. Shanti Feldon, in her book for young women only, for teen girls, she shares a stat from her survey, which I don't actually believe is accurate. I think she misrepresented the statistic. But what she shares is that 82% of boys feel little ability and little responsibility to stop in a makeout situation. And so if you don't want to go all the way, it's better to not even start. And that idea that
James Dobson put the Bible beside you. Like, I grew up listening to that crap. Yeah.
Yeah. The idea that 82% of boys, so think about what she's saying. 82% of boys have little ability to stop. Like, that's priming girls for date rape.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And when we tell girls, boys will push your sexual boundaries, we make it sound like that's normal. And so what we try to do in our book is give ways to reframe these messages. Like, instead of saying boys will push your sexual boundaries, what I would say to teenagers is this, okay? Having sexual feelings is normal. And, wanting to make out with someone is it's a normal part of just growing up. But what you do need to do is figure out what your boundaries are, and you need to have a plan to stick to your boundaries. Even more important than that, you need to honor the boundaries of the person that you're with.
Yes.
And if the person that you're with doesn't honor your boundaries, that is a red flag that something's wrong with the relationship and you need to get out.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I would say to teenagers. But instead, we've told girls, you are the gatekeeper. He can't help himself. Mm-hmm. And so you need to stop him from doing what he wants to do. And that
includes men. That includes adult men, because children are being told this, right? When they're sexually molested. Well, what were you wearing? What did you do? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a kid. In the case of the email exchange, this pastor was, I think at the time of his arrest, he was 56 or 58 years old, with a 15-year-old girl. Yeah. And they're talking about her. The elders are describing her as a young woman. They're talking about relationship. I hate that terminology. Mm-hmm. I hate when the media talks about this relationship between a teacher and a student, or a pastor and a young child, or whoever and a young child. It's not a relationship.
Yeah, he did not have sex with a 15-year-old. He raped a 15-year-old.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the whole idea that we can't expect men to control themselves and that women are responsible, that just messes everything up for everybody. I remember when my daughter was 11, my youngest daughter, she was told by her Sunday school teacher that now that you're developing, you can't wear V-necks anymore because the adult men will look at your chest. I couldn't get her to go to church for like a month. She was so freaked out by this idea that men were going to be staring at her chest. I mean, she was already mortified because she was developing anyway.
Yeah.
But I just wonder, why are churches spending all this time trying to get 11-year-olds to dress appropriately and not spending time giving sermons on how you shouldn't be looking at 11-year-olds' chests?
Right.
I love that.
I told you she's controversial.
No, I love that. That is so true.
It's amazing, and I think there's this ironic double message in the church, and I don't know if it's specifically the conservative church. It probably tends to be, but part of that is you need to dress modestly, you need to dress appropriately, or else you're the instigator who got this guy all riled up. But the other part of that message, the paradox is they're also told you need to stay fit, you need to be hot, because this last pastor that just got caught, right, publicly fat shaming women, saying that you need to stay hot for your husband, but not too hot. Like, it's this bizarre mixed message that makes no sense.
Yeah. And again, it just takes away the whole idea of intimacy from sex. Yeah. But it's not just physical. God never intended it to be only physical. It's so much more than that. And we're reducing it. We're making it so shallow. We're making the same mistake we blame the world for. We're just doing it in a sanctified way.
Yeah. I want to brag on your book a second, because you've caught in a lot of flack, and I've not read all the comments. I'm sad to say that, because you've commented about some of the comments that people have made about your book, and some of the 1-star reviews. I did read those and some of the comments, but I thought, here's a book that you have already. I think there's like over 300 reviews on Amazon, which is incredible for a new release. And it's a 5-star. Even with all those little 1 stars that people gave you, it's still a 5-star book. So the good clearly outweighs the bad that people are saying about this book. And I just think that's really commendable. And I want to ask you if you think your own book is resonating, if this message is resonating among Christian people.
I think it really is. And what is really making us happy is when we wrote it, we weren't sure if guys were going to read it. Like, we knew it was mostly going to be a women's book, but we did put in these check-ins throughout the chapters where couples can talk to each other. We have explore together exercises at the end of each chapter for couples, but we weren't sure if guys were going to read it. But so many of our reviews have been from men. And we've had so many guys saying, this book treated me with more dignity than any other Christian marriage book I've ever read. Because we go to bat for guys. Like, we say, guys, you are not like this. Like, it is not the men who are the problem with the obligation sex message. It is like what we heard over and over again was, my husband was the one who healed me. My husband was the one that God used to fix this for me. Like, this is not a male bashing book.
No, it's not at all.
We have all been sold a bill of goods, and we can get beyond this. And so I'm so excited to see how many guys are jumping on the bandwagon. And thank you, Jimmy, for having me on. This is great.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
The people that are pushing back are really the Christian evangelical leaders, because I'm taking on the biggest names, and they're accusing us of all kinds of weird stuff. Like the one I think is the funniest is, oh, she just surveyed 20,000 of her followers. Okay. First of all, the whole point of our book is we're comparing people who believe one thing with people who believe another.
Yeah.
We couldn't have done the survey. We surveyed 20,000 people who all believe the same thing, because in order to tell how the all men struggle with lust message affects women, we need to have women who believed it and women who didn't.
Right.
Like, and I don't even know what are they complaining about? Like, what we're showing is, hey, sex shouldn't be an obligation. We shouldn't say all men lust. We shouldn't say women are responsible for men's porn use. Yeah. And we shouldn't say boys are going to push girls' sexual boundaries. Why are they so upset about that?
Yeah, I know. No, I thought it was one of the most respectful books, and just the way that you guys wrote it. It really honored both the man and the woman, and really put them on equal footing. And I really appreciated walking through it. And I was like, this is not offensive in the least.
Right. It's an amazing
not
book, and it's written so well. It truly is. And of course, it's going to be controversial, because it's making waves as to what was once accepted as real knowledge, especially within the churches. So that's a good thing. If it's controversial, I think.
Yeah.
It's great. And you handle it well. You smile beautifully throughout.
I just think, if they want to take it on, it's like, you're not taking me on. You're taking on 20,000 women, and you're showing you don't really care. And when authors say, oh, she's just beating up on us and she should have come to us first, it's like, you know what?
No.
If you teach in public, you're corrected in public, and you are not the victim. Right. Authors, you are not the victim. The victim is the people that have been harmed, and Jesus is concerned for the sheep. Yeah. And so our concern should be the same place.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I don't feel either, like, you know, when I'm reading it, I don't get the impression that you're like, I'm going to take down these authors because I have, you know, I'm going to elevate my book by taking down other people. Like, you are really respectful even to people you disagree with. And you out, like, I like how you tied that to the surveys. You know, here are the messages that are in these books. Here are how people respond to them. So it's not a personal attack. It's not even any kind of attack. It's just saying this is what's written about the books, and here's how that affects people. And I think that's really important.
I just think it's exciting that so many people are reading this book. It is truly, isn't it? It's just awesome. It really is to see that because there's a hungering and a thirsting for information like this, for change, for rectifying what we've kind of messed up through wrongful messages. So it's exciting. I'm so glad you're here.
And Sheila, this is probably an unintended consequence of your book, but or effect, not consequence, but it's forcing parents like me with young kids to talk about sex with our kids, because I'll have you know, I had this book sitting out after I ordered it. I opened up I put it on the log table, and my 7-year-old son walks by and he says, "Oh, the Great Sex Rescue." He's like, "What's that about?"
Well, like you, I work with you work with your mom, I work with my daughters, and so that's always fun. It's a weird dynamic to do around sex, but we just talk about really weird things, and
I love it. I think it's great. Because I mean, there's got to be some sense of satisfaction in that too, for you as a mother, where it's a normalized thing to talk about because it's a gift that God gave us, you know, and it shouldn't be this weird thing that we can't talk about it. Like, I hope that our kids are as open as your kids, where you can sit down and you can talk very openly about it. And I think it's really cool. I think it's awesome.
And maybe this is a good place as we're winding up too, but you know, what I also want people to understand is that I didn't do this right with my own kids. Like, I'm totally messed up on puberty. That's why we created the puberty course that we have on our site, because my girls were always laughing at what a bad job I did. Like, some of the things I used to teach, like when I started my blog, I don't agree with anymore. Some of the things I taught even 2 years ago, I don't agree with anymore now that I've done the survey. And that's what I want people to get a glimpse of, is that we don't need to stay in the same box that we've always been in. It is okay to grow. It's okay to admit, hey, I used to say this and that was wrong. And I'm sorry for that. And so here's what I'm going to say instead now. And that's all I'm asking other authors to do.
Yeah.
You know, I'm very open in the book that I have not had this right my whole time writing. Yeah. There are things that I'm still learning, and I apologize for certain things that I've said. And I just hope we'll get in the habit of doing that, because isn't the Christian life supposed to be about growth? Like, we're supposed to be growing more and more like Jesus.
Yeah, I will say personally, you have definitely challenged a lot of my thinking in a good way. And I just gobbled it up. I loved it.
Now just think me and you can talk about sex.
Good Lord, no.
I want to hear all about it, Jimmy.
You see what I deal with here, Sheila?
Yeah.
Terrible. Well, again, Sheila Wray Gregoire, The Great Sex Rescue, The Lies You've Been Taught, and How to Recover What God Intended. We can't thank you enough, both for writing this, for putting your heart and soul into it, both you and Rebecca and Joanna. And we just thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, we thank you for tuning into this episode, and we'll catch you next round.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.